I stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, my heart sinking with each muffled laugh that drifted down from the family upstairs. My son, my own flesh and blood, had locked me away during their family photos, as if I were nothing more than a stranger to him. I had carried him, raised him, and loved him unconditionally, yet I was now invisible. But the truth can't be hidden forever. I was done being ignored. It was time to take them all to court, and finally make them face the picture I had been left out of. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The grand house was quiet, the air thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor stood by the door of the cold basement, her breath forming tiny clouds in the chilled air. The faint murmur of family chatter upstairs reached her ears, though muffled, like distant echoes. She could hear the soft click of the camera, the laughter, the happy voices. Everything a celebration that she was no longer a part of. She turned, hands clasped tightly at her sides, staring down at the unvarnished concrete floor, her heart sinking a little more with each passing second. The musty scent of the basement, a mixture of old books, damp wood, and dust, had never bothered her before, but now it felt suffocating. "Basement's better for you." Richard's voice had sliced through the silence earlier, an order as cold as the stone walls surrounding her. His words were sharp, but it was the underlying cruelty that had twisted her insides. He didn't even look at her when he said it. His back turned, the door closing behind him with a finality that made her feel invisible. Lydia's smirk lingered in the air like a bad taste, and Eleanor had heard the faint click of the lock, a final, deliberate action. The sound was like a heavy weight settling on her chest. She walked over to the corner of the room, running her fingers along the old, worn chair in the dim light. The basement felt like a prison now, every corner echoing with the sounds of the family upstairs, gathering for a photo they would show the world. A photo with everyone in it, except her. She pressed her hand against the cool surface of the window, looking out at the familiar neighborhood. Somewhere out there, people were living lives that didn't revolve around this house, this family, these walls. She thought about her late husband, how he would have never allowed this, would have never let their family fall apart like this. Above, the sound of the camera shutter clicked again, sharp and deliberate. The flashes of light, though invisible from the basement, felt like they were marking the distance between her and them. A family that once cherished her now erased her. A quiet rage simmered beneath her calm surface, but she stayed still, her posture rigid, her breathing controlled. Eleanor could almost hear the words in Richard's voice. "You're nothing but a shadow now." From the shadows of the stairwell, the creak of a door opening interrupted her thoughts. Sophie's face appeared, her expression a mix of disbelief and sadness. "Sophie, don't," Eleanor whispered softly, not wanting the girl to witness this. She had always tried to protect her granddaughter from the ugliness of their family, but it was becoming harder. But Sophie didn't listen. She stepped forward, holding her phone in her trembling hands. Her eyes met Eleanor's, filled with quiet fury. It wasn't just the indignity of being hidden away that shocked Sophie. It was the violation of everything they once stood for. "Grandma?" Sophie's voice broke through the heavy silence, a whisper of defiance. This isn't right." Eleanor offered a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to watch." Sophie hesitated for only a moment before pulling out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly, capturing the sound of the family laughing above, the snapping of photos, the deliberate exclusion. A tear slid down Sophie's cheek as she filmed, though she tried to hide it behind a forced calm. It was wrong. So wrong. The sound of footsteps on the stairs grew louder, and Eleanor knew someone was coming. She wiped her face, steadying herself before anyone could see her falter. As the door creaked open, Ruth appeared, her warm, knowing eyes catching Eleanor's. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was enough. Ruth's arms wrapped around her in a quiet, powerful gesture of solidarity. "You'll make them regret this," Ruth murmured in her ear, her voice thick with resolve. Eleanor could feel the weight of the words settling in her bones, a promise that lingered between them. "Maybe," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but steady. "But I'll make sure they never forget." Sophie moved closer, putting her phone away, her gaze sharp. "Grandma, what do we do now?" Eleanor's eyes drifted to the stairs, to the muffled sound of laughter, the joy in the air above her. "Now," she said, a coldness creeping into her tone, "we let them finish their picture." But as the door to the basement closed again, sealing her away from the world, Eleanor's heart beat with a steady rhythm of resolve. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The camera above clicked again, but this time it was a sound she would use against them. She would be the one to capture the truth. The weight of the file felt heavy in Eleanor's hands, but it wasn't the paper itself that burdened her. It was the truth it carried. She sat at the desk in her small study, the room dimly lit by the fading afternoon light. Dust motes floated in the beams that slanted through the window, undisturbed by the noise of the family still lingering upstairs. The house, though large and imposing, had become a mausoleum to a family she no longer recognized. She opened the file slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of the brittle paper. Estate documents, her estate. The house, the business, everything she had built over the years. She had never considered them as anything other than part of her legacy. But this was a revelation. Each page she turned brought a sharper sting, a deeper wound. The documents confirmed her majority ownership of the home, the family business, everything. Richard, who had always acted like the head of the family, the one pulling the strings, had never owned the house outright. It was hers, and it always had been. The realization washed over her like a cold wave. He had lied, manipulated, and controlled, all for the sake of his image. Her fingers paused over the final page, where the numbers and signatures were clearly marked. This was evidence. Evidence of Richard's lies, his greed, his plans to take it all from her, to erase her. But the real irony? He had never owned it in the first place. The door opened with a soft creak. Daniel entered, his footsteps deliberate, measured. He was calm, as always, but Eleanor could see the sharpness in his eyes as he surveyed the documents she had laid out before him. "So, this confirms it," he said quietly, his gaze flicking over the pages. "Richard never owned the property outright. He's been lying to everyone, including you." Eleanor's lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes dark with the weight of it all. "Yes. And now, I have something to take back. Something they thought I didn't know." Daniel nodded, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the papers one more time. "This is leverage, Eleanor. This is everything we need to bring him down." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked down at the file in front of her, the truth laid bare before her. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a growing sense of power. The idea of retaliation, of taking control, was no longer a far-off dream. It was within her reach. Richard had underestimated her, but her mind was already moving forward, beyond the file. She had other things to consider, other moves to make. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face a mix of confusion and anger. Eleanor smiled at her, a small, almost imperceptible smile. She could see the girl's frustration, the unspoken need for justice reflected in her eyes. Sophie had already witnessed the cruelty. Now, she would witness the reckoning. "Grandma," Sophie said quietly, her voice filled with the weight of unsaid words. "They posted the photo." Eleanor's gaze flickered to the phone in Sophie's hand. The screen displayed the perfect family portrait, Richard and Lydia smiling, arms wrapped around each other, while the empty space beside them was a glaring, painful reminder of Eleanor's absence. She didn't need to see it again. She had heard it all, the fake laughter, the show they put on for the world. That's fine, Eleanor replied, her tone steady, almost cold. Let them post. Let the world see what they want. But the truth is coming. Sophie's expression softened, though the fire in her eyes never faded. What will you do? Eleanor's lips curled into a smile, sharp and full of resolve. I will publish the truth, and it will be more powerful than any photo. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of what was to come. The plan was already forming in her mind, carefully, deliberately, each piece falling into place. She could already see it. The public shaming, the revelation, the truth coming out in a flood. The world would know exactly who her family was. Ruth appeared in the doorway now, her presence like a steadying force. She had watched this family tear itself apart for too long, and she was ready for the fight. Are we ready? Ruth asked, her voice low but full of determination. Eleanor met her gaze, unflinching. We are? Sophie glanced between them, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and anticipation. You're really going to do it? Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes, they'll regret hiding me. And they'll regret thinking they could erase me from everything. Ruth's eyes gleamed with approval. And they'll never see what's coming. Eleanor stood, the file still clutched in her hands, her resolve hardening with each breath. It's time to remind them, the truth always finds a way to the surface. As the three women stood together in the dim light of the room, the weight of what was to come seemed to settle in the space between them. Eleanor wasn't just going to fight for what was hers. She was going to expose the lies, take back what was stolen, and ensure the world knew the true face of her family. And Richard? He would never see it coming. The file in her hand felt like the first step in a journey that could no longer be stopped. She was ready. They were ready. And the first chapter of the end was already being written. The sounds of trucks rumbling up the driveway echoed through the house, their engines low and rumbling like an approaching storm. Eleanor stood by the window in her study, the thick curtains drawn back just enough for her to see the workers unloading tools and supplies. The sight made her stomach turn. Contractors. There was no reason for them to be here. No permission had been sought. No notice given. She didn't need to ask what was going on. She knew. Richard had decided to remodel, to tear down parts of the house, perhaps even the parts that had always been hers. A violation, plain and simple. The house was her legacy, and he had no right to make any changes without her consent. Eleanor moved slowly, deliberately, her gaze never leaving the workers as they unloaded heavy equipment. She walked to her desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out her journal. Her pen scratched across the page as she began documenting everything: the trucks, the workers, the tools scattered across the front yard. This would be her evidence. It would be another piece of the puzzle, another violation she could expose when the time was right. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She closed the journal and took a deep breath before walking over to answer it. Lydia stood in the doorway, a thin smile on her lips, her presence as cold as the air outside. Eleanor, she said, her voice sugary sweet but laced with malice. I thought you'd like to know. We've decided to make some improvements to the house. We didn't think you'd mind. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She could see the smug satisfaction on Lydia's face, the gleam in her eyes as if she were daring Eleanor to protest. Eleanor knew that Lydia wasn't here to inform her. She was here to remind her that she had no say in anything anymore. She was no longer part of the family. Not in Lydia's eyes, at least. Lydia, Eleanor said softly, her voice controlled. You can't do this without my permission. It's my home. Lydia's smile widened, the edges sharp. Well, you see, Eleanor, we've decided that it's time for a change. You're not exactly in a position to make demands. Eleanor stood tall, the weight of her own truth anchoring her. I don't need permission to be part of my own life, Lydia. Before Lydia could respond, Richard appeared from behind her, his expression tight, his eyes narrowed. You've got nothing to say about it, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The decision's been made. The house is getting a facelift. It's time to let go. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She stood her ground. This isn't a facelift. This is a violation. You've made changes without informing me, without any legal process. And that, Richard, is something I won't ignore. Lydia let out a sharp, mocking laugh, drawing the attention of the workers outside. She raised her voice, knowing they were listening. Don't worry, Eleanor. You can keep yourself busy with your paperwork while we fix the house. It's long overdue for a makeover. A few of the workers glanced toward the door, their eyes shifting nervously. Eleanor could see them exchanging glances, unsure whether to be involved in this family drama. But Lydia wasn't finished. She took a step closer, her voice low and biting. It's not your house anymore, Eleanor. Lydia spat, her words sharp as knives. You're just a ghost here, a relic, and it's time we moved on. The sting of her words hit harder than expected. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, the ache of humiliation cutting through her. But she stayed silent, letting the words fall away, knowing they would only carry weight if she let them. Sophie, who had been standing quietly in the hallway, her phone in hand, stepped into the room at that moment. Eleanor glanced at her, and Sophie, sensing the tension, raised her phone just enough for Eleanor to see it was recording. Sophie's face was set with quiet determination. She would not let this moment slip by without capturing it. Eleanor gave her a brief, grateful nod, her gaze returning to Lydia and Richard, who were now standing side by side. Lydia's eyes sparkled with vindictive pleasure as she watched Eleanor's reaction. Richard crossed his arms over his chest. You're still a part of this family, he said, his voice cold and dismissive. But you're a spectator now, Eleanor, not an active participant. Eleanor's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Instead, she turned her back on them and walked toward the door. Eleanor, Lydia called after her, her voice a mocking sing-song. Where are you going? Don't you want to watch? Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. As she stepped out of the door and onto the front steps, she could feel the eyes of the workers on her, their curiosity palpable. She didn't care. They could see what they wanted to see. Ruth appeared beside her on the porch, a quiet strength beside her. Ruth had been watching from the window, and now she stood as her ally, the one person who truly understood the fight Eleanor had ahead. They think they can erase you? Ruth said, her voice low but full of conviction. They'll learn. Silence photographs best. Eleanor turned toward her friend, the edges of her lips curling upward in a small, knowing smile. They'll regret this, she said, the words carrying a weight they couldn't yet understand. As the workers continued their noisy work in the background, Eleanor stood still, her eyes fixed ahead, her mind already turning the next phase of her plan. The humiliation was just a spark. The fire that would follow would burn everything they had tried to take from her. They had made their move. Now, it was her turn. And the world would see the truth. The sound of the front door slamming shut was the first signal. Eleanor had been standing by the window, watching the contractors move in and out of the house, the weight of their tools and the heavy thrum of machinery vibrating through the air. But it wasn't the noise that sent a chill down her spine. It was the sudden, unmistakable silence that followed. Sophie was the first to notice. Her gaze flicked toward the driveway, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. "Grandma," she murmured under her breath, the words barely escaping her lips. "Something's happening." Before Eleanor could respond, a car pulled up sharply at the curb. Richard stepped out, his face flushed with anger, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Lydia, too, was with him, her eyes wild, the horror of something unexpected settling over her like a cloud. Behind them, a sheriff's deputy emerged from the car, a stack of official-looking papers held in his hands. Eleanor knew what was happening before the first word was spoken. The injunction had arrived. The deputy approached the workers, speaking calmly but with undeniable authority. He handed over the papers, and the group of contractors froze, their expressions unreadable, though a few glanced at each other with uncertainty. There was no doubt. This was it. Richard's plans had just been derailed, and his fury was about to explode. Richard's face twisted with disbelief, his lips curling into a sneer as he stormed toward the sheriff. "What is this?" he barked. "This is my house. You can't just stop the work like this. I have every right." The deputy remained unmoved, his tone level as he handed Richard the injunction. "You'll have to take that up in court, Mr. Hayes. For now, the work is to cease. No further construction is permitted without due process. These papers are legally binding." Richard's fury flared, his face going red with rage. He threw the papers to the ground, and they fluttered briefly before settling at the deputy's feet. "This is a mistake. You don't know who I am." Eleanor could hear his voice rising, the pride that had once made him arrogant now melting into panic. This was the moment he had been dreading, and it was playing out in front of her. Lydia, who had been silent up until now, broke down into a high-pitched shriek. "This can't be happening. This was supposed to be perfect." She swung her arms dramatically, sending a nearby contractor scrambling backward, his face a picture of discomfort. The workers slowly began to pack up, unsure whether to leave or protest. They were caught in the middle of a family's drama, their livelihood now hanging in the balance. Eleanor stood there, silent, watching as her son and daughter-in-law crumbled before the reality of legal authority. Richard tried to regain some composure, his chest heaving with anger. He turned on Eleanor, his gaze icy with accusation. "This is your doing," he spat. "You always have to make everything difficult. You think a piece of paper is going to stop me?" But his voice wavered. The fury in his words didn't match the defeat settling in his posture. Eleanor remained still, not even flinching at his words. She'd seen his anger before, but this was different. This was the sound of control slipping away from his hands, and Eleanor could feel the weight of the victory settling into her bones. Sophie stepped up beside Eleanor, her hand brushing her grandmother's arm in quiet solidarity. She didn't speak, but the gesture was enough to make Eleanor feel a sense of calm amidst the storm. Sophie wasn't afraid of Richard's wrath, and Eleanor wasn't either. Lydia's shrieks of frustration echoed through the yard, but they were fading in comparison to the sound of the deputy instructing the workers to leave. The contractors, now fully aware of what had happened, began to pack up in silence, their motions slow and deliberate. The hum of the machines, once so loud and oppressive, died down, and the world felt quieter, more still. Ruth stood by the porch, her face unreadable, though her eyes twinkled with approval. "Papers louder than drills," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Eleanor's lips quirked into a smile, thin but sharp. "It is. And they'll learn. They all will." Sophie wrapped her arms around Eleanor in a brief, quiet hug. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of the small victory, the quiet power that Eleanor had reclaimed. The workers filed out of the yard, their trucks leaving one by one, and the once bustling scene now stood frozen, like a picture of defeat. As Richard and Lydia fumed, standing at the heart of the front yard, their plans in ruins, Daniel appeared at the end of the driveway. His eyes were calm, his expression sharp and calculated. He walked toward Eleanor, his movements steady and purposeful. "This is leverage," Daniel said, his voice low, his gaze never leaving Richard. "And more is coming." Eleanor didn't need to ask what he meant. She knew. The chessboard was set, and Richard had made his first move. But Eleanor? She was playing a longer game, one that would dismantle everything he thought he controlled. The storm had passed for now, but the clouds were still gathering on the horizon, and Eleanor Hayes was ready for the thunder to break. The small office, nestled at the back of the house, smelled of leather and paper. Eleanor sat at the desk, the light from the desk lamp casting sharp shadows across the old wood. Her fingers hovered over the pile of bank statements that lay in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying everything that had happened: Richard's aggression, Lydia's manipulation, the way they had tried to erase her from everything. But this was different. This wasn't about their cruelty. This was about the money. the heart of it all. And if Eleanor was going to take them down, it would start here, with the accounts they thought they could hide. The door creaked open, and Daniel stepped inside, carrying a stack of papers. His face was calm, but the tension in his jaw told a different story. He placed the papers on the desk, flipping through them methodically, his eyes scanning for something specific. "Anything?" Eleanor asked, though she knew the answer. They were on the edge of something big. She could feel it. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He pushed a page toward her, his finger pointing to a series of transfers that stood out like red flags. Large sums of money, transferred between accounts in ways that didn't make sense. "Look at this," he said, his voice quiet but tinged with disbelief. "Richard's been siphoning money from the family accounts." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she studied the numbers. It wasn't just a few hundred here or there, it was thousands, moving between personal accounts that had no business being linked. But it didn't stop there. Lydia's name appeared on several of the transfers too, with shopping sprees that were far more extravagant than anyone would have imagined. Lydia had always cared about appearances, but this was something else entirely. It was a betrayal. And Eleanor felt the cold burn of realization crawl under her skin. Daniel pulled out another document and placed it on top of the others. Receipts, all from high-end stores. Designer clothes, jewelry, luxury items. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the list, her mind struggling to piece together the picture. It wasn't just the money being funneled away. It was the greed, the excess, the complete disregard for anything other than their own desires. Sophie appeared at the door holding a small envelope in her hand. She stepped inside, her face grim. She didn't say anything at first, just handed Eleanor a stack of receipts that made Eleanor's stomach churn. "Found these in Lydia's purse," Sophie said quietly. "She didn't think I would notice, but I did." Her voice was firm, but there was an underlying sadness in it, one that Eleanor had seen in Sophie's eyes before. This was the moment when the veil was lifted, and the world they had all been living in was shattered. Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat as she looked over the receipts. The numbers on them didn't lie. Every item had been charged to the family business account, items that had no place there. The shopping sprees, the indulgence, the betrayal. It was all there, in black and white. "They're digging their own basement," Ruth said, her voice low as she stepped into the room. She had been waiting in the wings, always ready to provide support when it was needed most. Her presence, strong and steady, made Eleanor feel like she wasn't alone in this fight. "It's time," Eleanor whispered, her eyes scanning the evidence. She felt the weight of it, the mounting fury, the betrayal. But she didn't allow herself to feel overwhelmed. She had been calm before, and she would be calm now. It was time to strike. She stood up from the desk, her movements purposeful. Her gaze was steady, unflinching as she looked at Daniel. "We file the suit now. Not just eviction. We hit them where it hurts the most. Fraud. I'll sue for everything. The house, the business, all of it." Daniel's lips twitched in a tight, approving smile. He had always known Eleanor was capable of this, but there was something different about the way she stood now, something that made him respect her even more. "You're sure?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. He knew she had already made up her mind. Eleanor nodded, her voice quiet but filled with determination. "This isn't just about the house. This is about exposing them for who they really are, for what they've done." Sophie's eyes shone with a mixture of pride and relief. She hadn't said much, but Eleanor knew her granddaughter was with her every step of the way. Ruth's lips curled into a small, approving smile. "They'll never see it coming," she said softly. Eleanor turned away from the desk, her gaze focused on the window. She could hear the faint sounds of the contractors packing up, the hum of the machines now silenced. But this was only the beginning, the calm before the storm. And when the storm hit, Richard and Lydia would have no idea how to weather it. Eleanor took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. The pieces were falling into place, and she could see it now. The game had changed. The stakes had been raised. And Richard? He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The knock on the door was sharp and final, the sound echoing through the empty house like a declaration. Eleanor looked up from the window where she had been standing, the sunlight slipping through the curtains in slow, golden slants. For a moment, everything was still. The world paused before the next chapter of her plan began. She moved toward the door with calm determination, her footsteps soft but purposeful on the polished floor. When she opened it, there stood the sheriff's deputy, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. "Ms. Hayes?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Eleanor nodded, her eyes steady. "Yes?" He extended a thick stack of papers toward her, his hand steady. "You've been served." The words hit like a stone. Eleanor took the papers from him, feeling their weight. The sheriff nodded once, and without another word he turned and walked away, his boots clapping against the porch with rhythmic finality. The door clicked shut behind him, and Eleanor stood there for a moment, holding the papers in her hands. She didn't need to look at them right away. She knew exactly what they were. Documents that would change everything. Her suit against Richard and Lydia had officially begun. Sophie, who had been standing in the hallway, moved to her side. Her face was full of nervous anticipation, but Eleanor could see the flicker of pride in her granddaughter's eyes. "Grandma, this is it, right?" Sophie asked, her voice thick with emotion. "This is really happening." Eleanor nodded, her gaze never leaving the papers in her hands. "It's happening." Sophie watched as Eleanor sat down at the table, the papers spread out before her. The lawsuit was official now, an eviction notice, but also something far more damaging: fraud, embezzlement, the house, and business. It would strip Richard and Lydia of everything they had taken for granted, but there was no joy in Eleanor's expression as she looked over the papers. No gloating. This wasn't a game for her. This was about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The family had never cared about her, but they would soon see just how much they had underestimated her. A shadow appeared in the doorway: Richard. He stood there, his face contorted in disbelief, his expression a mixture of anger and something darker. Lydia was behind him, her hand clutching his arm, her eyes wide with a frantic fear that was hard to mask. Richard's eyes locked onto the papers. His lip curled into a smirk, but there was something brittle in the way he carried himself. "You really think you'll win this?" he sneered. "This is just a waste of time, Eleanor. You don't have the power. You'll lose." Eleanor didn't flinch. She met his gaze coolly, her voice steady. "Court takes better pictures, Richard." The words landed with a finality that made the room feel smaller. Richard's face reddened as he took a step forward, his voice rising with incredulity. "You think you can take everything from me? You've got nothing. You've lost your place here. You've lost your family. And now you think you'll take my money too?" Eleanor remained silent, her face a mask of calm as he shouted. Inside, the storm was raging, but outwardly, she was as still as a stone. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about something far bigger. It was about proving that she had the strength to tear down the lies that had kept her silent for so long. Sophie stepped forward, her eyes flashing with quiet defiance. She handed a small flash drive to Daniel, who had been standing by the door, watching with a calm intensity. The recording from Sophie's phone, proof of the lies, the manipulations, and the outright theft, was now in Daniel's hands. Richard's eyes darted between them, his expression darkening with realization. "What is that?" he demanded. "What's on that drive?" Daniel's face remained impassive. "The truth," he said simply, slipping the drive into his pocket without any further explanation. Lydia, unable to stay silent any longer, finally spoke up, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "You're making a huge mistake, Eleanor. You're throwing everything away. This will ruin us. Don't you care about the family at all?" Eleanor's gaze shifted toward Lydia, and for the first time she saw the panic in her eyes. She had spent so many years catering to their whims, to their need for control, for appearances. But now, Lydia was just another player in Eleanor's game, a game she was about to win. Family, Eleanor said slowly, her voice calm and unwavering, is about trust, not manipulation. Ruth, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. She had been watching the family drama unfold, her eyes gleaming with approval. "The best part about all of this, Richard," Ruth said, her voice dripping with satisfaction, "is that you never saw her coming. You thought she was done. But Eleanor always knew how to play the long game." Sophie stood by her side, her arms crossed, her expression resolute. "And now they'll know the truth, the one they tried so hard to bury." Richard's face twisted with fury, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't need to respond. She had already won. As Richard and Lydia stood in the doorway, their world falling apart around them, Eleanor looked out the window, her gaze distant. The papers were delivered. The fight had begun. And Richard? He had just made the worst mistake of his life. The phone rang sharply, its sound cutting through the quiet of the house. Eleanor had been sitting in her favorite armchair, the one by the window, watching the world outside in stillness. The last few days had been full of motion, the crescendo of her actions building with each step she took. But now, the moment had arrived. The truth was about to spread. She reached for the phone, her fingers steady as always, and answered without hesitation. "Eleanor Hayes." A voice on the other end was brisk, professional, but Eleanor could hear the excitement just beneath the surface. "Ms. Hayes, this is Sarah Thompson from the Chicago Ledger. I've been following the recent events surrounding your family, and I'd like to speak with you about the fraud lawsuit you filed. We're interested in the details. This could be big." Eleanor's heart didn't race. She didn't feel the rush of adrenaline most would expect. This was exactly what she'd prepared for. She had known the exposure would come. How could it not, after everything that had unfolded? But instead of panic or fear, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction settle into her chest. It was time for the world to see the truth. "You can print whatever you like," she said, her voice cool but measured. "But make sure you tell them that the only thing I'm guilty of is protecting what's mine." Sarah Thompson's tone shifted, sharper now. "Of course. But we'd love to get more of your side on how this all came to be. We're hearing whispers about the family, the business. It's all very intriguing." Eleanor didn't give her the satisfaction of more words. "The details will come out in court. Everything's on record. Just follow the paper trail." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor looked out the window, her thoughts already moving ahead. The storm was starting to swirl. Gossip would spread like wildfire, no doubt. The city would buzz with whispers of betrayal, deceit, and family betrayal. Her family's empire, built on lies, was beginning to crumble. Within the hour, the first whispers of the story were everywhere. Social media exploded. News outlets picked up the tale. Eleanor Hayes versus her family. Fraud lawsuit rocks Chicago elite. And from there, it spread. The ripple effect like a tremor through the city's underbelly. People who had once smiled politely at Richard and Lydia at social gatherings now turned their attention to Eleanor's quiet defiance. The truth was unraveling, and the story became too juicy for anyone to ignore. Lydia was the first to panic. She stormed through the house, her face flushed with rage, her fists clenched. The phone calls were constant now, press inquiries, messages from friends who were now concerned about her, asking how she could be involved in something so messy. She had spent years building her perfect image, curating every detail of her life to perfection. And now? Now it was all falling apart, and she had no way to stop it. "Do you see what they're saying about us?" Lydia screamed, shaking her phone in Richard's face. This is a disaster. We're being torn apart. They're saying everything. Everything." Richard didn't respond right away. He was pacing the room, his face contorted in a grimace. Eleanor's suit had shocked him, but the press. This was something he hadn't anticipated. He'd never expected her to go this far. He'd underestimated her, just as she had known he would. "I don't care what they say," he muttered, his voice low and tight with frustration. "This will blow over. We'll make it go away." But deep down, Richard knew he was lying to himself. The public eye was already too focused, the damage too deep. He was no longer in control. He could see it, feel it. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, bit by bit. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat quietly in her home, unshaken. She had already won. The media frenzy, the whispers, the judgment. It didn't matter. She had no interest in the attention. What mattered now was that the world saw her for what she truly was, a woman who had fought back. A woman who had taken control of her own fate after a lifetime of being pushed aside. Sophie sat beside her, watching the news coverage unfold on TV. The family was everywhere now, exposed, humiliated. Richard's attempts to control the narrative, his denials, were met with skepticism. The cracks in the facade were too wide now to ignore. "They'll never pose the same again," Sophie said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "They thought they could hide the truth, but they can't anymore." Eleanor turned to her granddaughter, her face unreadable. She knew that Sophie was right. The world would see who Richard and Lydia really were now. Nothing but charlatans hiding behind masks of wealth and lies. Eleanor stood and walked toward the window, her silhouette framed by the fading light of the afternoon. There was a sense of finality in the air. The storm was building outside, and she knew that the real battle was yet to come. But for now, Eleanor could feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: peace. As the news broadcasted the family's downfall, Eleanor stood tall, a quiet strength filling her from within. This was her moment, her story, and the world was finally listening. The morning light filtered through the blinds in Eleanor's study, casting narrow beams of warmth across the room. The house was quiet, the tension from the past few days hanging in the air like a charged current. But Eleanor was calm, her focus clear. She was prepared for the next phase of her battle. The envelope had arrived early, tucked neatly between the stack of unopened mail. She had almost missed it. A thin, nondescript envelope. But the contents inside would change everything. Inside was a pawn slip. Her pawn slip. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she slid the paper out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the details. The date, the amount, the items that had been taken from her. Richard and Lydia had gone further than anyone could have imagined, pawning off family heirlooms, precious items that had been in their family for generations, all for their selfish gain. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about betrayal on a scale she hadn't anticipated. Eleanor turned the slip over in her hands, the reality of it sinking deeper with each passing second. The heirlooms, pieces of her past, had been sold off without a second thought. Her late husband's watch, the pearls her mother had worn, all gone, all buried in the dark corners of pawnshops, hidden beneath the surface of their fraud. She didn't have to look at Sophie to know her granddaughter was just as horrified as she was. The news of the pawned items had spread like wildfire through the media, but this was different. This was the moment when Eleanor would expose everything. Richard and Lydia had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. "I need to press the claim," Eleanor murmured, her voice steady, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something more determined. Sophie nodded, her face pale, but her eyes bright with determination. She had witnessed the depths to which Richard and Lydia would go. She wasn't afraid to speak the truth. She was ready to testify. As they made the decision to move forward, Daniel entered the room, his calm presence like a steadying force. His eyes flicked to the pawn slip in Eleanor's hand, and he took a moment before speaking. "This is it. With the claim, we can prove everything. It ties the financial fraud to theft. It's the last piece of the puzzle." Eleanor nodded. She had thought about this moment for days, knew what it would mean. The theft, the embezzlement, the lies. It was all part of a much larger plan now. No one would be able to deny the truth once it was all laid out in court. But it wasn't just the financial misdeeds that would bring Richard and Lydia down. It was their desperation, their willingness to sacrifice everything for their image that had led them to this point. Their own arrogance would be their undoing. As they prepared the legal papers, a sound from the hallway interrupted their thoughts. A sharp cry, followed by the sound of frantic footsteps. Eleanor and Sophie both turned to the door. Lydia burst into the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. The weight of the past few days had caught up with her, and now it was breaking her down. Her composure, once so calculated and cold, had shattered. She collapsed against the wall, her breath shallow and frantic. "This is too much! This is all too much!" Lydia screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her failure. "We're finished. It's over. Everything we built is falling apart." Eleanor stood still, watching her daughter-in-law unravel before her. There was no satisfaction in her gaze, no victory. Just a quiet, steady realization that Lydia had finally reached the end of her rope. The power, the control, everything they had held over Eleanor was now slipping away, piece by piece. Sophie stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "You don't get to destroy everything and then act like the victim, Lydia. You've been lying to everyone. You've taken from us, from Grandma, from this family, and now the truth is coming for you." Lydia's shoulders shook, her face crumpling in defeat as she sank to the floor. "You don't understand," she whimpered, her voice barely audible. "I did it for us. I had to keep up the image. People were expecting perfection. I couldn't let them see what we were really like." Ruth, who had been silently watching from the doorway, stepped forward, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. "The shine's gone, basement's brighter now." Her voice was low, but the words carried the weight of a truth Lydia had been too blind to see. Richard had always been the architect of their carefully constructed world, but Lydia had been its willing accomplice. And now their world was crumbling beneath them, and there was nothing left to do but watch as the walls fell. Daniel's gaze hardened as he gathered the paperwork. "We're ready," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This will be the final piece. The trial is just around the corner." Eleanor turned to him, her face calm but resolute. "Let's bring this home." As Lydia sobbed on the floor, Richard still pacing like a caged animal, Eleanor stood tall. She wasn't done yet. This was her moment of reckoning, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Richard and Lydia would face the consequences of their greed, their lies, their theft. It was time for the truth to come out, and for her to reclaim everything they had taken. The courtroom awaited. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as Eleanor walked in, flanked by Ruth and Sophie. The air felt heavy, the weight of the stakes pressing in on her chest, but she didn't falter. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the culmination of everything she had endured, and the final reckoning for Richard and Lydia. Her footsteps were steady, her head held high. She didn't look at the reporters, the murmurs of the crowd, or the eyes that followed her. She kept her focus ahead. Richard and Lydia were seated in the front row, their faces a mask of fury. Lydia's hands gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Richard sat with his arms crossed, a sneer curling on his lips, though there was a tremor beneath the bravado. The realization was setting in. They were in deep. They had underestimated Eleanor in ways they couldn't undo. And now they would pay. Eleanor didn't acknowledge them directly, but her eyes briefly flicked to their tense postures as she passed. A quiet satisfaction settled over her. They had spent years manipulating her, pushing her aside, erasing her from their lives. But today, they would see the cost of their actions. The truth was about to be laid bare. As Eleanor took her seat at the table with Daniel, Ruth, and Sophie, the judge entered, a man of middle years with an air of no-nonsense authority. The room quieted as he took his place behind the bench. "Let's proceed," the judge said, his voice firm, the gavel striking once to punctuate the start of the trial. Daniel, calm and collected as ever, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, we are here today to address a case of gross financial misconduct, theft, and property violations perpetrated by the defendants, Richard and Lydia Hayes. The evidence presented will demonstrate the full scope of their actions, actions that go far beyond simple greed. These are acts of betrayal, designed to strip my client, Eleanor Hayes, of her rightful inheritance and legacy. The words rang through the courtroom, a sharp reminder of what was at stake. Eleanor sat back, her gaze focused, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had prepared for this. She had been patient. Today, the truth would speak louder than any of Richard's lies. The proceedings continued, each side presenting its case. Daniel's voice was calm, surgical, as he laid out the evidence. Bank records, pawning slips, fraudulent transfers. Each document, each piece of proof, another brick in the wall that would soon crush Richard and Lydia's carefully constructed lies. But it was the moment Sophie took the stand that made the courtroom hold its breath. Sophie was calm, her voice steady as she spoke. I was recording, she began, her eyes flicking to Richard, who had shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The things that were said when they thought no one was listening. I have recordings of conversations that show exactly what happened, how they manipulated funds, stole from my grandmother, and tried to erase her from everything. She handed the recordings to the judge, her hand unshaken despite the gravity of the moment. The judge listened carefully, his face impassive, but the room could feel the shift. The truth was taking form. The evidence was clear. Richard and Lydia had no escape now. The recordings revealed the depth of their lies, how they had made Eleanor feel small, invisible, as they siphoned off money from the family business and even pawned off heirlooms that held immeasurable value to Eleanor. Each word, each admission, was a nail in their coffin. But the moment that sent a ripple through the courtroom came next. Daniel stood again, his voice steady, as he introduced the final piece of evidence. Your Honor, we also have photographic evidence, Daniel said. A photograph taken on the day of the family's annual photo shoot, a moment they deliberately erased Eleanor from. This photo, time-stamped, shows the defendants smiling together in the upstairs living room while my client, Eleanor, was locked in the basement. The room went still. Richard's face went ashen, his eyes wide with realization. Lydia's face flushed red with a mix of disbelief and shame. Sophie, her eyes hard with purpose, handed the judge the photo. It was a powerful image, a picture of a happy, perfect family, captured for the world to see. But beneath that surface, hidden in the shadows of the frame, was the truth. Eleanor, left in the cold, locked away in the basement, while her family presented a false face to the world. The silence that followed was thick. Eleanor could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, and yet she remained composed. She had already won. The truth was out now, and nothing could take that back. Richard's eyes darted around the room, his anger mounting. He stood up suddenly, his voice rising. This is a lie. This is all just a scheme to ruin us. The judge's gavel struck sharply, cutting through his outburst. Mr. Hayes, you will remain silent during these proceedings. Any further outbursts will result in contempt of court. Lydia, meanwhile, sat frozen, her face pale as the magnitude of what was happening sank in. Her facade had cracked. The perfect family, the perfect life. They were all gone now. Ruth, sitting next to Eleanor, leaned in and whispered, "Shine's gone. Basement's brighter now." The words felt like a soft, satisfying echo in the room. The light was shining on the truth now. There was no way out. The trial had only just begun, but Richard and Lydia's fate was already sealed. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The judge, a man of sharp precision, leaned over his bench, studying the photograph Sophie had handed to him. The image was still, yet it pulsed with the weight of everything that had been hidden for so long. Eleanor could feel the eyes of the room on her. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She remained calm, her face set in an expression of quiet strength. She knew this was the moment when everything Richard and Lydia had worked to conceal would come crashing down. The judge's gaze lingered on the photograph, his brow furrowing as he examined it closely. His fingers traced the edge of the photo, the faintest sign of acknowledgement in his demeanor, but still, he said nothing. The room was waiting. Sophie stood beside Eleanor, her posture unwavering. She was the quiet force behind this victory. The recordings, the evidence, the pawn slip, everything had led them here. But it was this photo, this single image, that would be the final nail in the coffin. Your Honor. Sophie's voice cut through the stillness, steady and resolute. The timestamp is clear. The photo was taken at precisely 2:00 p.m., the time when my grandmother was locked in the basement. You can see Richard and Lydia in the background smiling, posing for the camera. The truth is, in that moment, the judge's eyes flicked to the timestamp on the bottom corner of the photo. He glanced back at the image, then over at Richard and Lydia, who sat frozen in their seats. The weight of the moment was undeniable. Lydia's face turned a deep shade of crimson. Her hands, once trembling with anger, now shook with humiliation. She looked around the room, her eyes wild as if searching for some way to erase the truth, to make it disappear. But there was no escape now. In the back row, Ruth leaned in close to Eleanor, her voice low but full of satisfaction. Now that's a family picture, she whispered, her eyes glinting with approval. Eleanor's lips quirked into a thin, controlled smile. She didn't respond, but Ruth's words carried the weight of everything Eleanor had endured. The years of mistreatment, the attempts to silence her, the lies they had woven to erase her from their lives. The truth was out now, and nothing could take it back. Richard's face was a storm of fury. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with an ear-splitting screech. "This is nonsense," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is all a setup. A lie." He pointed towards Sophie, his finger trembling with rage. "You think you can ruin everything I've built? You think you'll win?" His words echoed in the room, but there was no force behind them now. The anger in his voice was desperate, almost pleading. He was losing control, and everyone could see it. The facade was shattering, and he was too blinded by pride to accept it. Lydia, her face buried in her hands, let out a strangled sob, the reality of the moment crashing down on her in waves. She was no longer the woman who could control every situation with a smile, who could manipulate anyone to do her bidding. The truth had stripped her bare, exposed her for what she truly was. Eleanor remained silent, her gaze unwavering. She had done what she came to do. The picture, the damning photo, had shown the world what Richard and Lydia were capable of. Their lies were now visible for all to see. And Eleanor? She had reclaimed her voice, her power. The judge took a deep breath, his gaze still fixed on the photograph. The room held its breath as he prepared to speak. But before he could, Richard exploded again, this time with an almost primal scream of frustration. "Enough! This is wrong!" Richard shouted, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "You'll regret this. You can't take everything from me. You won't win." He was pacing now, his hands trembling with the effort to maintain some semblance of control, but the mask had cracked completely. The judge raised a hand, his tone stern and final. "Mr. Hayes, I will not tolerate any further outbursts. You will remain seated, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Richard hesitated, glaring at the judge, but the gavel came down with a sharp rap, silencing him in an instant. The judge then turned his attention to Eleanor, his voice soft but laden with gravity. "Ms. Hayes, the evidence is overwhelming. The actions of the defendants are clear." Eleanor nodded, her gaze unwavering. She had known all along that this moment would come. She had prepared herself for it. But now, as the courtroom fell silent, as all eyes turned toward Richard and Lydia, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The fight wasn't over yet, but it was already won. The judge paused, then spoke again. "The court will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements. In the meantime, I expect all parties to refrain from any further disruption. As the courtroom began to empty, the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Richard and Lydia were defeated, and it was only a matter of time before the final verdict came. Eleanor stood tall, her heart steady, knowing that she had finally taken back what was hers. But as they filed out of the courtroom, Ruth leaned in close to Eleanor again, her words a soft whisper. "It's not over. Not yet." And Eleanor knew she was right. The battle had been won, but the war was still on. The courtroom was quiet as the day's session came to a close, the tension still thick in the air. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed ahead, though she could feel the weight of Richard's eyes drilling into her back. The room had emptied out, the murmurs of the few remaining spectators drifting away into the hall, but the world outside was far from silent. Richard and Lydia had been silenced in their own way, but their defeat was not yet complete. Richard's face was a storm of fury and desperation. He had been quiet all through the proceedings, though his agitation was palpable. Now, as the final echoes of the judge's gavel faded, he turned to Eleanor, his expression hardening with an unreadable mix of pleading and rage. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but filled with urgency, "you don't have to do this. We can settle this quietly. You don't need to drag this through the courts any longer. Let's make a deal. This can all be over." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She simply sat there, her fingers pressed lightly together, her gaze unflinching. The room was dimming with the evening light as the tension between them thickened. Richard shifted uneasily, leaning forward, his voice a little sharper now. "You're ruining us, Eleanor. You have to understand. We're at the end of our rope here. This is going to destroy us socially, financially. Think about Sophie. Think about everything we've built. We can end this now. A simple settlement." Eleanor's eyes remained locked on his. There was no trace of sympathy there, only the clear, quiet strength that had carried her through all of this. She had spent her life bowing to Richard's manipulations, her worth and existence reduced to something beneath him. But now, as he sat before her, broken, desperate, she felt the power she had reclaimed settle firmly within her bones. "The courtroom's the only photo I want," Eleanor said, her voice steady and cold, each word carrying a quiet authority that made Richard flinch. "There's no negotiation, no quiet end. This is how it ends. The world will see what you've done, Richard. They'll know who you really are." Lydia, who had been sitting with her head bowed, her hands shaking slightly in her lap, suddenly lifted her head. Her face was pale, the weight of the public scrutiny already breaking through her brittle composure. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the words barely escaping. "Eleanor, please. Think about what this will do to us. You've seen the headlines, the gossip. You know how this works. This is going to ruin us socially. The media, the people we know, they'll never forgive us. This will destroy everything." Sophie, standing by Eleanor's side, spoke then, her voice clear and unwavering. "Truth doesn't blur, Lydia. No matter how many headlines you pay for, no matter how many people you try to convince, the truth will always come out. You can't change it now." She looked down at Lydia, her expression not unkind, but firm. "It's over." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft shuffle of papers being rearranged by Daniel, who had been quietly observing the exchange. His eyes flicked to Eleanor, his face impassive, but his eyes held a quiet respect for the resolve she displayed. He had known from the start that this was about more than money or property. It was about dignity, about reclaiming what had been taken from her. Richard, now visibly sweating, ran a hand through his hair in frustration, his breath coming out in sharp, panicked bursts. "This isn't fair," he spat. "This is going to ruin us. You've taken everything from me, everything." But Eleanor didn't flinch. She had taken everything, yes, but it had never belonged to him in the first place. This was her moment of reclamation, her moment to remind him, and the world, who she really was. She turned to Daniel, her voice quiet, but filled with the weight of a decision already made. "We don't settle," she said firmly. "We see this through." Daniel nodded, his gaze focused and calculating. "It's the right call," he replied, his voice unwavering. "We have the evidence. The truth will carry us across the finish line." Ruth, standing near the back of the room, leaned in close to Eleanor, her eyes gleaming with approval. She had seen this moment coming, had witnessed the transformation in Eleanor from the quiet, overlooked woman to the one now wielding her truth like a weapon. "You were always going to win," Ruth murmured softly. "But now they see it too." Eleanor turned her gaze back to Richard and Lydia, who were both trembling, their hands fidgeting in their laps. Richard had finally fallen silent, but the bitterness in his eyes spoke volumes. He knew he had lost. His empire was crumbling, and he would have no one to blame but himself. "I'll see you in court," Eleanor said, her voice carrying through the room with a finality that settled like stone. She stood, turning to leave, Sophie and Ruth following her without a word. As they walked out of the courtroom, Eleanor's mind was already focused on the next step, the closing statements, the final act in the drama that had been years in the making. The fight wasn't over yet, but the end was in sight. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt the weight of victory on the horizon. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the judge took his seat once again. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, the sound reverberating through the room like a final tolling bell. The trial had come to its end, the evidence laid bare, the truth exposed in its rawest form. All that remained now was the verdict. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze fixed on the judge. She didn't flinch. She didn't fidget. She had waited years for this moment, and now that it was here, it felt almost surreal. But there was no rush of victory, only the calm, steady certainty that this was where she belonged. This was the reckoning. Richard and Lydia sat across from her, their bodies tense, their eyes darting around the room in a mix of defiance and growing dread. Lydia had once held herself with such unshakable poise. Now she was a picture of shattered composure, her hands twisted in her lap, her face pale. Richard, ever the prideful one, sat rigidly, trying and failing to maintain his air of authority. The defeat was undeniable, but he refused to acknowledge it. Not yet. The judge, a man of measured calm, shuffled his papers one last time before looking up, his gaze briefly sweeping across the courtroom. He didn't need to speak to the jury. The evidence had spoken for itself. Eleanor had presented the facts: bank records, pawn slips, recorded conversations, and the damning photo. Richard and Lydia's schemes had unraveled in front of the world, and now the time for judgment had come. "The court has reviewed all evidence presented," the judge began, his voice steady. "It is clear that the defendants, Richard and Lydia Hayes, engaged in a series of fraudulent activities intended to deceive and exploit Eleanor Hayes. Their actions have caused harm, financial, emotional, and personal, and they will be held accountable." Eleanor's heart beat steadily in her chest. The moment she had been waiting for had arrived, but her face remained calm. She had fought for this. She had taken everything they had thrown at her. And now, it was her turn to watch, as they were finally brought to justice. The judge turned his attention to Richard first. "Mr. Hayes, you have been found guilty of fraud, theft, and property violations. Your actions were not only a violation of trust, but also an attempt to erase the rightful ownership and legacy of your mother. As a result, the court hereby awards Eleanor Hayes full ownership of the family property, including the house and the business." Eleanor's breath was steady, but her mind raced with the gravity of the ruling. The house, the business, everything that had been stolen from her was now hers. She had fought for it, and now it was in her hands. But it wasn't just the property that mattered. It was the principle, the final shred of her dignity reclaimed. Her hands stayed folded in front of her, though she could feel the weight of the victory settling into her bones. The judge's voice cut through the stillness once more. Furthermore, damages will be awarded to Ms. Hayes for the financial and emotional harm inflicted. The sum will be substantial, reflecting the severity of the misconduct and the years of mistreatment. Richard's face twisted in disbelief. He had been so sure that his wealth, his power, would shield him from the consequences. But there was no escape now. The wall he had built around himself had crumbled, and the weight of the judgment was crushing him. Lydia's face had gone ashen. She opened her mouth to speak but was silenced by the sharp look the judge cast in her direction. Her world, which had once glittered with illusions of control, was now slipping through her fingers like sand. The press, the public opinion, the social connections she had spent years cultivating, they were all lost. She was no longer the darling of the elite. She was the woman who had been exposed as a fraud. As the judge finished his ruling, Eleanor allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had done it. She had fought back. But her gaze never wavered from the defendants. She didn't need to say anything. The court had already spoken. The judge leaned back in his chair, the weight of his decision clear. Mr. Hayes, you will be responsible for the full repayment of damages, and the court orders that the remaining assets be liquidated to cover the amount. Your bankruptcy proceedings will begin immediately. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but his words faltered as he realized there was nothing left to say. His empire had collapsed, his wealth, his reputation. It was all gone. Lydia, too, was speechless. She could only sit there, the walls closing in around her. Her once perfect life had unraveled in a matter of days, and now, all she had was her shame. Sophie, standing beside Eleanor, squeezed her grandmother's hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The two of them had come this far together. Sophie's eyes glistened, filled with pride, but also something deeper. Something that came from knowing they had weathered the storm together. Ruth, ever the steady force, leaned in slightly and whispered to Eleanor, "The world will see them for who they really are, and they'll never forget." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She turned her head slightly, taking in the quiet finality of the ruling. Richard and Lydia, the people who had tried to erase her from everything, were now paying the price for their actions, and she had reclaimed everything that had once been hers. The courtroom was clearing out, the crowd dispersing, but Eleanor stood still, her back straight, her gaze steady. The trial had been brutal, but this was the moment of redemption. She had fought, and now she had won. Sophie stepped closer, wrapping her arms around her grandmother in a tight, unspoken embrace. "You did it, Grandma. You really did it." Eleanor's voice was calm, but her eyes held the quiet satisfaction of a battle fought and won. "We did it, Sophie. We did it." And as they walked out of the courtroom together, the weight of the world seemed to lift. Eleanor's fight was over, at least for now. But the truth had been told, and no one could take that away. The lawyer's office was quiet, save for the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of the city outside. The room, with its dark wood panels and shelves lined with thick law books, felt heavy with history. It was here, in this unassuming space, that Eleanor would make her final decision, the last step in her long, hard-fought journey to reclaim her life. Eleanor sat across from Daniel, her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression serene. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind. Richard and Lydia's public humiliation, the trial, the verdict. But now, the pieces of her life that had been scattered and broken were falling back into place. The property was hers. The legacy was hers. And now, the family she had once tried to protect would be excluded from it entirely. Daniel, as always, was the calm in the storm, his face focused as he placed the final document in front of her. The will. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently, though he already knew the answer. Eleanor's decision was final, and nothing would change it now. But the question was asked more for his own peace of mind than hers. He wanted to make sure she was prepared for what came next. Eleanor's eyes flickered briefly to the doorway, where Sophie stood quietly, her face tense with emotion. This moment wasn't just about the property or the business, it was about the family. It was about Richard and Lydia, the people who had betrayed her, the ones who had tried to erase her from everything. "I'm sure," Eleanor said, her voice steady, each word measured with a quiet authority. "Richard and Lydia have done enough damage. They've had everything, and now they will have nothing." She signed the will with a smooth, practiced motion, the pen gliding across the paper like it had done 1,000 times before. But this time, it meant something different. This time, it was her victory on paper. A victory not just over them, but over the system that had enabled their cruelty for so long. Sophie moved forward, her eyes wide and glassy. She took the will from Daniel's hands and handed it to her grandmother, who smiled gently at her. "It's done," she said, her voice soft but filled with the strength of everything she had overcome. "You're my heir now, Sophie. Everything is yours." Sophie swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat as she looked down at the will. The words felt surreal, too heavy to fully comprehend. The house, the business, everything that had once been tainted by Richard and Lydia was now in her hands. But it wasn't the wealth that mattered. It was the truth. The legacy of the woman sitting across from her, the woman who had fought to reclaim her life. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, and without saying a word she stepped forward, wrapping her arms tightly around Eleanor. It was a silent embrace, one that spoke volumes of the bond they shared. A bond forged in loss, in hardship, but now finally, in victory. Ruth, standing in the corner of the room, smiled to herself, her eyes bright with approval. She had witnessed every moment of Eleanor's transformation, every step from the quiet widow to the force of nature that stood before her now. She had always known Eleanor would win. The world had underestimated her, but not Ruth. Ruth had seen the fire within her. "Best snapshot yet," Ruth said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "They thought they had it all, but they never understood what you had, Eleanor. You have the truth, and that's all that matters." Eleanor turned to Ruth, her face serene, but her heart filled with a quiet peace she hadn't known in years. The truth had been the hardest part to hold on to, the hardest thing to trust. But now, it had led her here. "I couldn't have done it without you, Ruth," Eleanor said softly, her voice thick with gratitude. "You were always there, even when I couldn't see the way forward." Ruth chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling with the sharpness of someone who had seen enough to know how the world worked. "We're a team, Eleanor, and now it's your turn to shine." The room fell into a comfortable silence, but the weight of the moment wasn't lost on any of them. Eleanor had fought for her legacy, and now, Sophie would carry it forward. But just as the peace began to settle, Daniel cleared his throat, his voice steady. "There's one more thing, Eleanor." She looked up, her expression curious. Daniel's eyes met hers, his usual calm demeanor tinged with something more. "I've been working with a charity for underprivileged children, kids with a passion for photography. They want to set up scholarships for aspiring photographers." Eleanor's brow furrowed slightly, but she listened intently. Daniel continued, "Given everything you've been through, I think you should consider donating the damages from your case, not to mention the publicity. It would honor your legacy, and your family's legacy, in a way that's truly fitting." Eleanor was silent for a moment, the suggestion hanging in the air. It wasn't just the money, it was the meaning behind it. A way to turn the pain of her past into something positive, something that could help others who had never had the opportunities she had. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, let's do it. The money will go to them." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't say anything. Eleanor's decision was final, but the emotion in her granddaughter's eyes was clear. This was a new chapter, one that wasn't defined by what she had lost, but by what she was giving back. The charity would thrive, the kids would have a chance to build their futures, and Eleanor's name would be linked to something greater than herself. It was a fitting end to the story of betrayal, and the beginning of something new. As they left the office, the weight of the world seemed to lift from Eleanor's shoulders. She had reclaimed her life, her truth, and her future. She had won. The press release went out just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. The photography fund was officially launched, its mission clear: to provide scholarships to underprivileged children with a passion for photography, giving them the opportunity to capture the world through their lens, just as Eleanor had done so many times in her life. Sophie stood at the front of the room, her hands shaking slightly as she cut the ribbon, marking the beginning of something that would outlast the courtroom battles, outlast the years of humiliation. This was the legacy Eleanor had chosen to leave, one that would inspire, uplift, and give others the chance to build something beautiful from nothing. The room was filled with donors, local press, and a few of Eleanor's old friends who had quietly rallied behind her during the tumultuous weeks that followed the trial. As the cameras flashed and the reporters asked their questions, Sophie stood tall, holding the reins of her grandmother's legacy with the same quiet strength Eleanor had shown her throughout the years. As the press took their shots, Sophie felt a lump in her throat. She had spent years watching her grandmother fade into the background, her existence reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the family's story. Now, Eleanor's name would be synonymous with strength, resilience, and generosity. It was a quiet revolution, a victory not just in the courtroom, but in the world that had turned its back on Eleanor for so long. Ruth stood to the side, her eyes glistening as she watched the press swarm Sophie. The excitement in the room was palpable, but Ruth's gaze was locked on Eleanor, who stood apart from the crowd. She had always known this day would come. Eleanor's triumph was never a question, just a matter of when. But to see it unfold, to see the legacy finally take shape, moved her in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I never thought I'd see the day," Ruth whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she walked over to Eleanor. "You did it, Eleanor. You changed the story. You changed everything." Eleanor smiled, her face serene, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "We did it," she corrected, her gaze drifting toward Sophie, who was now being interviewed by a local reporter, her words full of pride and grace. "Sophie is the future. I've had my time." Ruth's smile deepened and she placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "You're a force, Eleanor, and you've just begun to show the world who you are." The press coverage was swift, and the story spread like wildfire. Local news outlets hailed Eleanor as a champion of justice, a woman who had turned years of pain into a gift for the next generation. The photography scholarships became a symbol of hope, a reminder that, no matter how much the world tried to erase someone, the truth could still find its way to the surface. But as the coverage continued, there was a shift in public perception. Richard and Lydia, once the darlings of society, were erased socially. Invitations to events stopped coming. Friends turned their backs. Their once glorious lives had unraveled so completely that there was no rebuilding. The truth, like the sharpest blade, had cut through their facades, leaving them exposed for all to see. Eleanor didn't feel the need to say anything about them anymore. They were irrelevant now. Her victory wasn't about their downfall. It was about the children who would be given opportunities, about Sophie carrying forward a legacy of truth, dignity, and resilience. The evening drew to a close, and Eleanor stood with Sophie, both of them at the edge of the event, looking out at the crowd. The noise had died down, the flurry of flashing cameras and interviews fading into a quiet hum. For a moment, it was just the two of them, standing in the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened. Eleanor turned to Sophie, her voice soft but filled with deep, quiet wisdom. "Smiles should include everyone, Sophie. Not just the ones who fit in, but those who are overlooked, those who are left behind. This," she gestured toward the crowd, "is for them." Sophie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she took her grandmother's hand. She had seen the battles Eleanor had fought, had watched her crumble and rise again, time and time again. But now Sophie saw the true depth of her grandmother's legacy, not in the property or the money, but in the lives they would change. Sophie squeezed her grandmother's hand tightly. "We'll make sure they never forget. We'll make sure the truth lives on." Eleanor smiled, her heart full. She had finally won, not just the battle for herself, but for the future. She had reclaimed her legacy, and now it would be remembered forever. But as they stepped away from the crowd, Eleanor couldn't help but feel a shadow lingering at the edge of her peace. The past had been dealt with, but she knew this was only the beginning. Richard and Lydia, though publicly shunned, still had power. And power, especially that kind, could be dangerous. The studio was quiet, save for the soft click of the camera and the rustling of fabric as Eleanor, Ruth, and Sophie arranged themselves in front of the backdrop. The moment had come, the real family photo. Not the one taken with forced smiles and hidden truths, but the one that spoke of redemption, strength, and the unbroken bond between them. Eleanor stood tall, her posture straight, her face serene. The years of humiliation, of being hidden away in the basement, now felt like a distant memory. Her heart was full, not of bitterness, but of a quiet satisfaction. She had fought for this moment, had fought to be seen and heard. And now, she was. The camera flashed, capturing the three of them as they stood united, a family not bound by blood, but by truth. Sophie stood beside Eleanor, her face filled with a quiet strength that mirrored her grandmother's. Sophie had been through so much, witnessing the cruelty of her parents, standing by Eleanor's side through the darkest moments. But now, she was the heir to a legacy built on resilience and justice. Her hand rested lightly on Eleanor's arm, a small gesture of solidarity, of love. Ruth, standing on the other side, her face lit with pride, had been the one to encourage Eleanor when all seemed lost. She had seen the fire in Eleanor from the very beginning, and had never once doubted that she would rise. Now, as they posed for the picture, Ruth's eyes shone with the kind of emotion that only comes from witnessing someone's transformation, from seeing them rise from the ashes of betrayal to claim their place in the world. The camera flashed once more, and the room fell into a peaceful silence. There were no words to be spoken, only the quiet acknowledgement of a victory so profound that it could not be fully captured in a photograph. The silence was heavy, but it was a peaceful one, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed, after all the chaos has finally settled. The photographer lowered his camera and gave a small nod of approval. He had captured the essence of their bond, the strength that radiated from them as a family. This was not just a photo. It was a symbol, a portrait of everything they had overcome, everything they had rebuilt. Eleanor turned to Ruth and Sophie, her eyes filled with a quiet emotion. "This is the picture," she said softly. "The real one." Sophie smiled, the tear she had held back earlier now making its way down her cheek. She leaned over and kissed Eleanor on the cheek, a simple act that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of gratitude, of love, of everything they had fought for. It was the moment that sealed their bond, a promise that no matter what happened next, they would stand together. Ruth's voice, low and filled with pride, broke the silence. "This picture's forever," she said, her eyes glistening. "You've made sure of that, Eleanor. The truth, your legacy, it'll be remembered for a long time." Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting to the picture that had just been taken, the one that would soon be framed and hung in their home. This was the image that would tell their story, a story of betrayal, exposure, and justice, a story of a woman who refused to stay silent and the family that stood by her, even when the world tried to tear them apart. As they left the studio, Eleanor's mind wandered back to the beginning of this journey. The basement, the humiliation, the lies, all of it had led her here, to this moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, she knew that. Richard and Lydia, though silenced, still had power. And power could be dangerous. But for now, she had reclaimed her place in the world, and nothing, not even their cruelty, could take that away. Eleanor, Ruth, and Sophie walked out of the studio, their steps in sync, their heads held high. The photograph would soon be hung in their home, a reminder not just of their victory, but of the love and strength that had carried them through it all. As they stepped into the evening light, Eleanor felt the weight of the world shift, the burden of her past finally lifting. This was the beginning of something new. The picture had been taken, the story had been told, and the world would never forget. They hid me in the basement during family photos, so I brought the whole family to court for one big picture.